Swift, agile, and hard-hitting, with ruthless crews that were willing to take on vessels twice the size of their own, the pirate ships were the scourge of the high seas. Armed with as many guns as possible, and flying the terrifying black flag of the Jolly Roger, these craft were ton for ton among the most fearsome sailing ships that ever roamed the ocean. Though virtually any kind of vessel could be adapted for buccaneering, the classic pirate ships during the golden age of piracy in the late 17th and early 18th centuries were generally of two types: larger three-masted vessels, often modified merchant ships, which could be armed with 30 to 40 guns, and smaller ships like the single-masted sloop, the two-masted schooner, and the rugged brigantine. Pirates used the bigger ships to intimidate their victims into submission. The more diminutive vessels were employed to mount swift hit-and-run attacks that depended more on the element of surprise to achieve success. Though small at under 60 feet in length, the 100-ton pirate sloop mounted a rapier-like bowsprit that was nearly as long as its hull, allowing it to carry enough sails to reach speeds exceeding 11 knots. Carrying up to 75 crewmen and 14 cannon, its modest size gave it the ability to maneuver in the narrow channels and shallow inlets where the pirates often hid. Ships like these made it possible for infamous marauders like Captain Kidd, Bartholomew Roberts, and the vicious Blackbeard to terrorize the oceans of the world, striking fear in the hearts of anyone who crossed their path. For as long as humankind has sailed the seas, there have been pirates to prey on the valuable cargoes carried by honest merchant ships. Men, and sometimes women, who would stop at nothing to enrich themselves through pillage and plunder. During the ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome, vessels carrying goods along trade routes in the Mediterranean were often the victims of raids by oar-powered pirate galleys. The word pirate itself actually derives from the Greek word peiron, which means to attack. Whatever era the pirates lived in, the ships they sailed were crucial to their success. They had to be large and powerful enough to overwhelm any potential prize, or they had to be small and maneuverable enough to strike their victims quickly and without warning.
It seems to me that you can characterize piracy on the high seas as two distinctly different but closely related methods. One of them is what I call power. Another, almost entirely opposite method is that of stealth. But in both cases, the objective isn't to blast them out of the water, to blast the prey out of the water, but to intimidate them into submission, to seek surrender, so that the cargo, the valuables, can be plundered and kept.
But no matter what their size, pirate ships needed to be rugged and deadly.
It needed most of all to be seaworthy, because it's often forgotten that the pirates made huge ocean voyages and they had to withstand storms and that sort of thing. And of course, they always made sure that they were well armed. That was the vital thing for a pirate ship.
The discovery of the New World by Columbus in 1492 launched one of the greatest periods of sea activity and piracy that Western history had ever seen. Spanish supply ships and treasure galleons sailing between Spain and the Americas made tempting targets, particularly to the seafarers from poorer European nations like England, who were excluded from legitimate trade with Spain's colonies. Fearful and jealous of Spain's growing wealth and power, Queen Elizabeth I of England instituted a policy of raiding Spanish shipping in the mid-16th century, even though the two nations were not officially at war. To supplement her small navy, Elizabeth employed a practice that was nearly 300 years old, called privateering. Privateers were privately owned vessels that carried written commissions or letters of marque from their government, authorizing them to plunder the ships of a rival nation.
Privateers basically operated during a time of war, and they were a way of augmenting a country's navy. What often happened was that privateers operated very successfully and made quite a lot of money. They could sell the ship and its contents and would get most of the value of that. And so there was a very narrow line between pirating and privateering, and the privateers certainly often became pirates.
To the country commissioning, then, privateers were a lawful extension of their fleet. But to the nation being attacked, the distinction between privateer and pirate was virtually meaningless. With only a scrap of paper separating the two groups, they usually considered these raiders to be pirates. Such was Spain's view of England's legendary privateer, Sir Francis Drake.
Francis Drake was a national hero as far as the British were concerned, because he was attacking the old enemy of England, which was Spain. But as far as the Spanish were concerned, he was an out-and-out pirate. He was attacking Spanish ships very often at a time when Spain was officially at peace with Britain.
In December 1577, Drake undertook his most ambitious expedition yet, a voyage aimed at attacking the rich Spanish ports and shipping along the western coast of South America. His flagship for the journey was the Golden Hind. Known as a race-built galleon, at 70 feet long and just over 100 tons, the Hind was faster and more agile than the larger Spanish treasure galleon she was designed to attack. Yet she was extremely rugged and seaworthy, giving her all the qualities necessary to be a successful pirate ship. She carried 146 crewmen and was heavily armed with 26 long-range cannon mounted along her sides. Once they reached the Pacific, Drake took advantage of the Golden Hind's features to raid Spanish merchant ships and settlements along the coasts of Chile and Peru. But his greatest exploit was yet to come. On March 1st, 1579, lookouts aboard the Golden Hind sighted a billowing sail on the horizon. As they drew closer, Drake recognized the vessel as the Spanish treasure galleon Señora de la Concepción. Drake had heard tales from his prisoners of the fabulous wealth carried by the Señora. He had also heard of her extremely heavy armament, a fact that had earned the Señora the nickname of Cacafuego, which loosely translated into English means Spitfire. But Drake was undeterred. He immediately employed a classic pirate tactic to capture the Señora: deception. He ordered his men to drag various items like mattresses and heavy pots behind the Golden Hind to slow her down, thus giving his ship the appearance of a lumbering merchant galleon. When the Señora drew near to discover the identity of this strange vessel, Drake suddenly turned the Hind toward the Spaniard and opened fire with a devastating barrage, overwhelming the larger ship before her crew could mount an adequate defense.
What in effect you have is the conflict between maneuverability and sea fortresses. The important thing is that he hulled her, and of course it caused a panic on board because she was beginning to take in water, and he was then able to board.
The loot Drake and his men found aboard the Señora exceeded their wildest expectations. Jewels, uncut stones, nearly 80 pounds of gold, and an incredible 26 tons of silver. It was one of the greatest hauls of all time, a treasure worth more than Queen Elizabeth's total revenue for an entire year. When the Spanish learned of the Señora's capture, they were more determined than ever to destroy Drake.
Spanish ships up and down the coast of South America were on the lookout for him. He realized that he couldn't get back down Cape Horn without being intercepted, so he decided the only thing to do was to set off across the Pacific. Only the second man in history to do it. Magellan had gone before him, but Magellan, of course, had died on the way home. So, in fact, when Drake returned home after circumnavigation, he was the first commander to take his ship all the way around the world, and as a result, he became a national hero.
The infuriated Spanish ambassador demanded that the Queen behead the piratical Drake and return his stolen booty. But Elizabeth had been an investor in the voyage and stood to receive a sizable portion of the treasure. Instead of punishing Drake, she ignored Spain's protests and knighted him right on the deck of his ship. To the Spanish, the Golden Hind had become one of the most reviled and successful pirate ships ever to sail the seas. It was a legacy that would inspire future generations of pirates and new generations of pirate ships. By the mid-17th century, the Spanish Empire was in decline. The power balance in Europe had already begun shifting toward England, the Netherlands, and France. These nations set their sights on expansion. The resulting explosion in global maritime trade, along with the natural evolution of shipbuilding methods, spurred shipwrights to develop a new generation of merchant vessels to replace the galleons that had been among the main targets of pirate ships during the 16th century.
There was a whole range of ships crossing the Atlantic. Most of them were three-masted because that had been worked out to be the most effective ship for a distance voyage. And a range of small merchant ships, 200 tons or so, much more than we imagine going across the Atlantic regularly in those days.
The most impressive of this new family of merchant craft was the East Indiaman, so named because they were originally built by the Dutch to carry cargoes of silks and spices from their possessions in the East Indies. These vessels were both faster and better armed than the earlier galleons, mounting up to 54 cannon. The standard three-masted merchant ships of the day could carry up to 16 heavy guns. And despite their sparse crews, these new craft were far more capable than earlier merchant ships. The pirates adapted by employing an updated variety of pirate ships. Vessels like the sloop, the schooner, and the brigantine, which originally evolved during the early 17th century as merchantmen themselves, possessed all the qualities necessary to make them ideal pirate ships.
What all of these vessels have in common is that they're not very large and that they're highly maneuverable. Consequently, I think it's important to note that they can actually be handled by a small number of men.
The maneuverability of these ships was enhanced by the fact that they were steered by tillers rather than wheels. This allowed their helmsmen to make faster alterations in course than were possible with the slower operating wheels required to move the bigger rudders found on larger ships. Though relatively small, these craft could still mount enough armament to make them a significant threat to the larger vessels they often attacked. However, they were never intended to stand up against a regular naval warship.
Pirate vessels were never as large as British ships of the line and would never seek to engage them in battle. They'd be outgunned, and there's no point. A pirate doesn't want to get shot down. There isn't any point in volunteering to go into battle with some navy. When you see the navy coming, you go the other direction. It was the business of the pirates to be better armed than their prey.
The route a pirate crew took to obtain a suitable vessel was often long and tortuous.
Their only opportunity, really, to improve the vessels under their command was to capture better ones. Oftentimes, pirates had a succession of vessels that they kept naming with the same name, each successive one being slightly larger with more guns, or in some way or another better suited to their work.
Along the way, the pirates would modify their new craft to suit their needs.
The important thing was to arm it with more guns, and so the carpenters would cut gun ports in the side of the ship. They would assemble a lot more carriage guns on wheels, and then they would fit on the rails of the ship, the sides of the ship, a number of swivel guns, which were these rather deadly anti-personnel guns. And that was it, really. If you had enough guns on a ship, you converted it from a merchant ship into what was, in effect, a small warship.
The pirate crew itself was also vital in terrorizing potential victims. Made up of desperate characters who cared little for the rules and regulations that governed traditional society, pirates were notorious for their ferocity in battle, and pirate captains would continuously seek new recruits from captured vessels in an effort to bolster their ranks. Many of these rogues plundered simply as a means of survival.
We tend to think that piracy was a rather jolly life, and lots of drinking and women and song and all that sort of stuff, and tropical beaches. And in fact, all the accounts of piracy give one the impression that piracy was a tough life. Pirates were mostly poor seamen, and they were very often on the verge of starvation. I mean, they had to capture their food. In fact, one of the interesting things is that when a pirate attacked a merchant ship, it didn't simply go for gold. It went for what we would call household goods. They wanted soap, they wanted rigging, they wanted spare sails and anchors, and, of course, any drink they could find.
The fearsome reputation of the pirates and their ships contributed mightily to their success. Many larger and more heavily armed merchant vessels surrendered without firing a shot, their crews preferring to throw themselves on the mercy of the buccaneers rather than risk being massacred. This element of terror was reinforced by the black pirate flag, the dreaded Jolly Roger. Although the exact origin of the name is unknown, many scholars believe that it stems from Old Roger, the nickname sailors at the time used for the devil.
The Jolly Roger is interesting. The pirate flags were originally either plain black or plain red, as far as we know, and that goes right back to Elizabethan times. And a red flag was rather sinister. It meant no quarter would be given if you saw the red flag flying. What happened round about 1700 was the black pirate flag came to be recognized as the symbol of piracy, and one or two pirates started putting a skull or bones on the black flag. The symbolism of this was simply universal. A death's head, as it was called, or a skull, meant death.
Many pirate captains adopted their own gruesome variations on the black and white motif.
Bartholomew Roberts, for instance, had a figure of himself standing on two skulls, one representing the head of a man from Barbados and the other from Martinique.
All these factors combined to make pirate ships among the most feared and deadly vessels ever. Despite their bloodthirsty image, however, the way the pirates ran their ships was in many ways more democratic than on other vessels of the period. One of the most important reasons for this was the background of pirate crews. Consisting of religious and political outcasts, convicts, escaped slaves, and deserters from naval and merchant ships, they were a highly diversified group. In fact, two of history's most colorful pirates were female, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. The integration of all types of people uniting for a common purpose on a basis that was, in theory at least, completely voluntary, contributed to a sense of brotherhood among pirates. But it required more than camaraderie to run a pirate ship. Men sailing under the legendary Bartholomew Roberts in the early 1700s were required to sign ship's articles that, among other things, guaranteed free and equal votes on all important matters. The document also had clauses that prohibited gambling, strictly regulated the division of booty, and provided for an early form of disability insurance by specifying that a cash payment be made to any pirate who was injured or crippled during his service. It even mandated a policy of lights out at 8 p.m. Such codes were common among buccaneers of the age.
These indeed are elements of democracy and egalitarianism and fair play, but it has to be remembered that those elements went only so far as the pirate brotherhood itself. There was no such thing as the victims of piracy also being accorded the same respect and consideration.
Standing at the top of the pirate hierarchy was the pirate captain. It was his seamanship and leadership qualities that, more than any other factor, determined the success or failure of the pirate ship. Unlike a naval or merchant captain, he was usually elected by his crew. As long as he maintained their respect, things ran smoothly. But he could be replaced if he lost the confidence of his men.
A pirate captain had to be, first of all, extremely tough and fairly terrifying in order to keep a difficult and anarchic crew in order. It was essential that he was what they described as bold in attack. They didn't want some ninny on board who was not going to go into attack when the moment came. And it was absolutely essential that a pirate captain was capable at navigating the ship, and if he wasn't, he'd be chucked out by the crew because they didn't want the ship going on the rocks.
The punishment for ousted captains was the same as for an ordinary pirate. The practice of marooning, stranding a condemned man on a deserted island with no food or water, was one of the cruelest forms of pirate punishment. Surprisingly, however, the penalty of walking the plank has never been proven to have taken place on a pirate ship. Despite the relatively even-handed treatment they received, pirates were independent by nature and seldom remained with the same ship for very long. Their loyalty was usually linked to their commander's success, a factor that depended on his skill and sometimes his luck. Ironically, one of history's most infamous pirate captains, was also perhaps its unluckiest. His name was Captain Kidd. If William Kidd had any good fortune at all, it was that he was able to live nearly 50 years in relative peace and obscurity. Born in Scotland in 1645, little else is known of his early life, except that he did not come from a family of seafarers. But eventually Kidd, like many men at the time, turned to the sea for opportunities that did not exist on land. In 1689, with England at war with France, he became captain of his own privateer brigantine in the Caribbean. After completing his stint against the French, Kidd settled in the English colony of New York, where he married and became a prosperous and respected merchant captain. Then, while in London on a trading venture, he met a man who presented him with a tempting offer: the command of a specially built privateer whose mission would be to prey on the French and pirate vessels that were wreaking havoc with English shipping in the Indian Ocean. The seemingly continual state of hostilities between England and France during this time had created a surplus of privateers, many of whom had few qualms about becoming out-and-out pirates when they couldn't find lawful prizes.
Seamen during times of peace often were out of work. There weren't any privateering ships to go on board. Seamen who'd been trained up in the Navy were suddenly out of work, and so the obvious thing to do was to capture a ship and set yourself up as a freelance pirate.
The rapid increase in buccaneering was unprecedented in maritime history, leading to the dawn of a period historians would later call the Golden Age of piracy. Carrying official letters of marque authorizing him to capture French and pirate vessels, Kidd set sail for the Indian Ocean on September 6, 1696. The ship he commanded was perfectly suited for its mission. Named the Adventure Galley, she was a state-of-the-art craft that combined speed, power, and maneuverability in a single package.
Just the name tells you two things. One is that the idea was adventure, not in the sense of a thrilling experience, but in the sense of a monetary enterprise. And galley, which signifies that there were oars on board, so that in addition to sail power, the crew could row themselves out of any trouble.
124 feet long and displacing 287 tons, the Adventure Galley had 3 masts and mounted 34 guns. Under full sail, her 3,200 square yards of canvas could drive her through the water at a brisk 14 knots. Larger and more heavily armed than most pirate ships of the era, she was as powerful as one of the early Royal Navy frigates that she resembled. Despite the sophistication of his ship, Kidd's voyage was rocky from the start. His crew, a mixed bag of ruffians and fugitive pirates, was far more interested in enriching themselves than in capturing buccaneers. During the long and uneventful trip to the Indian Ocean, their morale steadily declined. A man named William Moore expressed his displeasure a little too loudly, drawing the ire of the temperamental Kidd.
Moore was sitting on the deck, grumbling away, and Kidd came up to him and said, "What are you grumbling about?" And he said, "You're a lousy dog, we haven't got any money," so on and so forth. And Captain Kidd was so upset about that he picked up a bucket, a wooden bucket that happened to have iron hoops round it, and just thumped it down on his head. And being an iron-bound bucket, it was the end of Mr. Moore. He had a fractured skull and died the next day.
Unfortunately for Captain Kidd, his show of force only made matters worse. As the cruise continued with no vessels to attack, Kidd's crew became even more rebellious. Then, in February 1698, they finally captured a ship, an East Indiaman named the Quetta Merchant.
The Quetta Merchant was a fabulously wealthy ship, I think 700,000 pounds, which is tens of millions of dollars in today's coin, is what he found when they took this ship.
Since the Quetta Merchant's papers were French, Kidd believed that after over a year at sea, he had finally taken his first legitimate prize. But he soon discovered that the ship wasn't really owned by the French.
It was very unfortunate because there was a representative of the Grand Mogul of India on board. He couldn't really have captured a worse ship because he immediately started a diplomatic row.
By taking a nationality of ship that wasn't expressly covered in his letters of marque, Captain Kidd the lawfully authorized privateer and hunter of pirates, had unwittingly crossed the line into piracy himself. In a desperate attempt at redemption, Kidd urged his crew to fulfill their duty by attacking a pirate ship that the adventure galley encountered a few months later. Not only did they ignore him, but all except 18 promptly deserted to the buccaneers, taking most of the cannon and other equipment from the adventure galley with them. Now commanding a gutted ship with hardly any crew, the hapless Kidd had no choice but to set sail for home, where he was arrested and charged with piracy on the high seas. After languishing in jail for the better part of 2 years, he was finally brought to trial in 1701. Even though his crimes were minor compared to many pirates of his time, the British government decided to make an example of Captain Kidd.
The point behind that was that the party in opposition wanted to tie in the people who backed his voyage and make a major scandal of it and bring the government down. Well, that didn't work. But Kidd was still guilty of murder, and so he was tried formally at the Old Bailey and convicted of piracy and murder, and in due course hanged.
On May 23, 1701, Captain William Kidd was led to the shores of the Thames River at Wapping.
I'm walking down Wapping Old Stairs, down towards the foreshore there, because it was just a few yards along there, on the waterfront, between the high water mark and the low water mark, that they would set up the gallows, which was a simple shape like that. They would put a ladder up against it, and it was there for 400 years or so that the pirates were hanged at Execution Dock.
To the very end, bad luck stayed with Captain Kidd. On the first attempt, the hangman's noose broke and he fell to the ground. The second time it held. Kidd's corpse was later tarred, bound with iron straps, and displayed from a post at the Thames estuary, where it remained for several years as a warning to all pirates.
In another time and in another place, Kidd might have been congratulated for adding wealth to the British Empire by taking that 710,000 pounds off of a French ship. But it wasn't politically convenient at the time for the powers that be to see it that way, and Kidd probably should have known better.
Piracy did see a steep decline in the months following Captain Kidd's execution. Hounded by increased Royal Navy patrols, many buccaneers decided to abandon their lawless ways, either seeking pardons from royal officials or simply melting back into the indistinguishable mass of merchant seamen. When a full-scale war broke out between England and a Franco-Spanish alliance in late 1701, most of the freebooters that remained sought commissions as privateers with one side or the other, leaving the seas virtually free of pirates for the first time in years. But within a decade, there would be an explosion of oceanic marauding unlike anything ever seen. The height of the pirates' golden age was just beyond the horizon. Rising with it would be a figure whose name has become synonymous with piracy itself. Perhaps no other individual personifies the modern image of a buccaneer more fully than the pirate known as Blackbeard. Standing nearly 6 feet 4 inches tall, armed to the teeth, and bearded from neck to eyes, he appeared to many like the devil incarnate. His actions were as satanic as his looks, setting standards of fierceness and brutality that made his name a source of terror in the waters he sailed.
Blackbeard, who was probably the most colorful pirate of all, and actually not only wanted to be a pirate, but relished in being a pirate, loved every minute of it, dressed the part, acted the part, talked the part. Anything that Blackbeard did, he'd do as big and as grand as it possibly could be done.
Born Edward Teach in Bristol, England around 1675, Blackbeard started his career as a privateer. He developed a taste for plunder while serving in the war that began shortly after Captain Kidd's execution. When the conflict ended in 1713, Teach and his fellow privateers were suddenly thrown out of work. Rather than return to a life of honest toil on land or sea, he joined the thousands of privateers that flooded into buccaneering. The golden age of piracy was about to burst forth in its ultimate fury, unleashing a rogues gallery of freebooters like Edward England, Stede Bonnet, Charles Vane, and Calico Jack Rackham on the merchant shipping of the world. But Edward Teach would soon prove to be one of the vilest of them all. With his great strength and fighting ability, the young Teach rose rapidly, and by 1716 he was elected captain of his own pirate ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge.
She was described by one captain who was captured for a time as being a Dutch-built French Guineaman, which meant, in fact, she was a large merchant ship, armed with, I think, something like 40 guns. So she was a formidable vessel.
Most of her guns were carronades, short but large-caliber cannon that were devastating at close range. Shortly after capturing their ship, Teach and his crew were intercepted by a 32-gun British frigate that was patrolling the area in search of pirates. Rather than fleeing, as most buccaneers did when confronted by a warship, Teach decided to stand and fight. After a running battle, the British ship retreated. Emboldened by his victory, Teach sailed the Queen Anne's Revenge on a bloody rampage throughout the Atlantic, capturing prizes and abusing terrified sailors wherever he went. Those who were lucky enough to survive Teach's brutality told authorities of a fierce giant of a man with a thick black beard. Soon a legend was born. It was a legend that Blackbeard himself did everything he could to enhance. To make his appearance more fearsome, he wore his beard in long, matted braids. He even went into battle with slow-burning matches made of hemp cord jutting from under his hat to heighten his fiendish demeanor. Atop the mainmast of his ship, he flew his own personalized version of the Jolly Roger, depicting a skeleton aiming a spear at a bleeding heart.
Blackbeard, in a way, epitomizes the terrifying pirate captain. And in fact, he deliberately cultivated a terrifying image. He was ferocious towards his crew deliberately, and he cultivated an image of terror in order to persuade any ship that he attacked to surrender immediately.
By 1718, Blackbeard had looted at least 20 vessels between Honduras and Virginia, and the Queen Anne's Revenge was the flagship for a marauding flotilla of 4 ships manned by nearly 400 pirates. That May, he attempted his most audacious assault yet when he blockaded the port of Charleston, South Carolina.
You've got to remember that when a pirate ship, or indeed a naval ship, comes into harbour, it's like a whole army coming in. It will have 30, 40 guns at its disposal, so it can cause a lot of trouble. And he held up the town, and he forced them... Well, in fact, he burnt a lot of ships in the harbour mouth and plundered them, but he actually was after a medicine chest. It said that the theory is that his crew had syphilis, and he wanted the various things from the medicine chest to do something about it.
Afterward, most of Blackbeard's fleet separated, with each captain going his own way. Preferring to stay close to the rich hunting grounds of the South Atlantic coast, Blackbeard decided to set up a base of operations in nearby North Carolina. He wanted to use a sheltered channel called the Ocracoke Inlet. But the Queen Anne's Revenge was too large to maneuver safely in the channel's shallow waters. When the ship sank after running aground off Beaufort, North Carolina in June of 1718, Blackbeard chose as his new vessel a speedy sloop called the Adventure. With her small size and modest draft, she was much better suited to operating among the Ocracoke's labyrinth of sandbars. Ensconced in his new hideaway, Blackbeard felt safe from any vessel large enough to defeat him. But the authorities were about to strike back.
Blackbeard had become such a menace to the authorities, and in a way he was flagrantly putting himself up against authority. And so the governor of Virginia decided something had to be done about Blackbeard, and he put up a reward, and he persuaded the captains of 2 local ships, HMS Pearl and HMS Lyme, to lend their crews.
At dawn, on November 22nd, 1718, a Royal Navy lieutenant named Robert Maynard led the 2 sloops manned by 60 hand-picked sailors into the Ocracoke. He was counting on the element of surprise to help him achieve success. But it was not to be. Blackbeard had been warned by a local turncoat.
He in fact fired his guns and managed to cause one ship to not exactly sink, but she was so decimated by wounded that she had to halt. And so Maynard came up alongside in one small vessel, and a tremendous fight then took place.
After several minutes of vicious hand-to-hand combat, Blackbeard was finally killed. Almost at once, the fighting stopped. Having seen their leader fall, the pirates were too demoralized to carry on the battle.
Blackbeard was a swashbuckler. He was the classic swashbuckler. He was not the sort of man to be taken alive, and he seemed, even from reports, seemed even at the time of the sword play, to be enjoying himself mightily, and to be appreciating the good swordsmanship of his adversaries as well as his own men.
When Blackbeard's body was examined, it was found to have 5 gunshot wounds and over 20 stab wounds. Maynard ordered Blackbeard's head cut off and tied to the bowsprit of his sloop as a grisly symbol of victory. Blackbeard's body was then tossed overboard, where legend has it the headless corpse swam around the ship before sinking. The Battle of Ocracoke Inlet had taken a heavy toll on both sides. 10 pirates, including Blackbeard, were killed, with 9 others injured. Maynard also lost 10 men, with 24 wounded. Yet for all his bravery, Lieutenant Maynard only received the minuscule bounty of £1, 13 shillings.
It was considered simply part of his job. Capturing pirate ships was all in a day's work for the Royal Navy, so there were no particular awards.
Even the most heartless pirate might have felt a pang of sympathy for Lieutenant Maynard. His total share was something they might gamble away on a single toss of the dice. Honest work meant only one thing to pirates: honest pay, and there was little reward in that. It was such a realization that led one otherwise honest man to become the most successful pirate of all time: Bartholomew Roberts. The last great pirate of the Golden Age was one of its most colorful and, without a doubt, its most successful. In a career that lasted less than 4 years, Bartholomew Roberts, dubbed Black Bart, plundered an amazing total of 400 ships. Roberts dressed flamboyantly, shunned alcohol, and drank great quantities of tea. Yet despite his quirks, he was a remarkable navigator and a fearless warrior who maintained the respect of his crew like no other pirate captain of the era.
Bartholomew Roberts seems to have been one of those natural leaders. He was bold and decisive and everything needed in a pirate captain.
Born in 1682 in Pembrokeshire, Wales, Roberts is believed to have served aboard a Royal Navy ship for a short time in his late teens. But eventually he grew dissatisfied with life as an honest seaman when his vessel was taken while sailing in the Caribbean by a pirate ship under the command of the famous buccaneer Howell Davis in 1719. He quickly joined its ranks. It wasn't long before Roberts' seamanship and courage impressed Davis, as well as the rest of the crew of their ship, the Rover. When Davis was killed 6 weeks later, Roberts was elected the ship's new captain. He immediately embarked on a spree of plundering that is still unequaled. In late 1719, Roberts came across a Portuguese merchant fleet of 42 ships. Singling out the largest vessel, Roberts and his crew mounted a daring surprise attack, taking the ship before her escorts could react. The haul was astronomical: tons of sugar and tobacco and almost 80,000 pounds of gold coins. Wherever they roamed, Roberts and his men continued to take more prizes, cutting a swath of terror from the Caribbean to as far north as Newfoundland. During this arduous trek, the Rover wore down, and Roberts switched vessels several times. In 1720, he captured one of his favorite prizes, a 42-gun oar-equipped ship that was not unlike Captain Kidd's adventure galley. He named her the Royal Fortune. One of the distinguishing features of his new command was the large number of swivel guns she carried. By this time, Roberts was leading a squadron of pirate ships.
Roberts' fleet at one time was counted at 508 men aboard 4 vessels, which would tend to be a pretty intimidating sight for some merchantman, even if heavily armed, to encounter this pirate with black flags flying and guns ready to fire.
During one 3-day span, this marauding flotilla captured, burned, or sank at least 16 vessels. By the spring of 1721, Black Bart had brought shipping in the Caribbean to a virtual halt. Hardened by years at sea, Robert's crew became increasingly belligerent, often torturing their victims in an effort to find more of their valuables.
In my view, Bartholomew Roberts was a far more terrifying pirate than Blackbeard. He was utterly ruthless in dealing with prisoners. He would burn ships if there were people on them. He tortured people deliberately.
Black Bart's triumphs made him the most feared and wanted pirate alive. Then in February 1722, the Royal Fortune was riding quietly at anchor while its crew celebrated yet another capture, when they were surprised by a 60-gun British warship. Roberts himself was below decks at the time, eating a pirate version of turtle soup.
And we have this charming detail that he was eating Salmon Gundy when he was rudely interrupted by the Royal Navy. He got caught in that position that a pirate captain ought not to have been caught in. He was engaged, and he had no way out.
Knowing that his men were in no form to raise the sails and run, Roberts decided that a head-on fight was his only alternative.
An amazing battle took place actually in a tornado. There was rain, there was a gale, and they were firing guns, thunder and lightning coming down. It must have been an extremely dramatic moment. And Bartholomew Roberts was killed by a broadside fired by the naval ship within the first minute or so, and his throat was actually blasted out, and he fell across the guns, and one of his crew found him and burst into tears and chucked his body overboard, because that's what he said he wanted happen to his body if he didn't want to be captured.
Within hours, all of Robert's surviving crew members were prisoners headed for London to stand trial. A total of 165 men who served under Black Bart were accused of crimes on the high seas, the largest pirate trial ever held. Of these, 52 were hanged. With the death of Bartholomew Roberts, the curtain finally rang down on the golden age of piracy. Isolated pockets of brigands would survive, and pirates would continue to plague the world's oceans periodically, even to this day. But never again would there be a time of such complete anarchy on the high seas. Reacting to the threat of buccaneers like Blackbeard and Bartholomew Roberts, European navies grew bigger and better organized. With more and improved ships patrolling in larger areas, the scourge of piracy seemed to dissipate like smoke in the wind. Yet for a span of nearly a generation, these bold, cunning, and ruthless mariners had ruled the waves, becoming the central characters in some of the most vivid seafaring tales ever told.
Pirates were outlaws. They refused to accept the yoke and the mantle of responsibility with which most of the rest of us are saddled. Sometimes we accord them a grudging respect, sometimes even admiration, sometimes enough so that we forget the danger and ravages and violence and brutality and terrible deeds with which their careers are at least punctuated or perhaps consumed. In the final analysis, pirates were cruel and working against the best interests of humankind. These were people who were out to make an easy buck and have a good time.
The ships these marauders used helped make their legends possible. For those who sailed them, they could make their dreams come true. A vital ally bringing untold riches and glory. For those who were hunted by them, they brought nightmares, predators that were every bit as lethal as the buccaneers who walked their decks. Pirate ships left a striking impression on everyone who saw them. Even today, some 300 years later, the image of the pirates and their ships continues to capture our imagination, rousing the spirit of adventure in all of us.